The philosophy of René Descartes was once revolutionary, but for better or for worse, it is now in the air we breathe and the water we drink. Everybody knows, I think, therefore I am, even if the argumentation leading to that inference has withered away. Do a quick internet search, and you will find that Cartesian slogan on coffee mugs, smartphone cases, bumper stickers, and even hipster socks. Now, this influence is not just cosmetic, since Descartes' outlook deeply influences how we picture the world and our place in it. As someone who teaches philosophy, I can confirm that almost every undergraduate who takes their first philosophy course enters as a Cartesian skeptic in epistemology and a substance dualist in philosophy of mind. So, when the going gets tough, novices shrug their shoulders, dismiss the evidence of their senses, and say, couldn't it all be a deceptive simulation anyway? It may come as a surprise, then, to learn that not all philosophers share Descartes' skeptical views. Indeed, those, like John Deely, who have studied the history of ideas, know that better worldviews are available. Zooming out from a large body of data, Deely carved the Western intellectual trajectory into 4 ages of understanding. Such a coarse-grained historical taxonomy will shock analytic philosophers who always favor analysis over synthesis and who regard history as irrelevant. But Deely was never an analytic philosopher. So, looking at the Western timeline, he discerned 4 low-resolution patterns of thought. The first 2 ages of understanding, the ancient and the medieval, accord with standard histories of philosophy. Descartes, in this account, is the figure who inaugurates the 3rd segment of the timeline, the modern age. We may have entered a postmodern era, as Deely claims, but our current view of knowledge and of the mind is still colored by Cartesian assumptions in untold ways. As the knee-jerk responses of my novice students attest, Cartesian skepticism is often the default position. I thus want to explore and undo some Cartesian assumptions, especially those pertaining to perception. Descartes had a lot to say about how the world appears to, or more appropriately hides from, an experiencing subject. Thanks to him, philosophers now have to describe that familiar domain as the external world. My twofold task today will be to, 1, explain how Descartes reached his skeptical conclusions, and 2, show why he was wrong. Such explanations and criticisms have been done before, but as Deely puts it on the first page of 4 Ages of Understanding, I have an angle. Indeed, I propose to approach Descartes' ideas from a semiotic perspective. Here's how I will divide my time. First, I want to go over the key semiotic ideas that I intend to use. Second, I will explain why Descartes was so worried about perception. Third, I will apply the semiotic ideas discussed in the initial part to undo Descartes' worries about perception. Now, since the philosophical issues that I'm interested in affect even those who aren't familiar with Descartes, a good place to begin would be with ordinary life. One of my neighbors, a few houses down the street, has a van parked in his driveway which says, on its side, "Signs for sale," or something to that effect. My neighbor no doubt makes a good living from this. But I make a living as a semiotician, so I know that he cannot actually be selling signs. To be exact, my neighbor is in the business of crafting sign vehicles. And by vehicle, I don't mean the van. Rather, I mean anything which serves as a sign instead of being a sign. You can paint whatever you want on any surface you choose, but those designs will become a sign only once they are interpreted as standing for something. What my neighbor sells is thus a node in a triadic relation. Without the arcs connecting that node to other nodes, the physical thing that he produces would mean literally nothing, although it would forever retain a potential to be interpreted. In a way, those working in the sign vehicle making industry already know this, since I occasionally see unpurchased advertisement spaces on public benches and recycling bins that say, "You just proved that these signs work." The idea in sum is that the very act of reading this statement confirms that the cleverly placed advertisement can reach potential customers, because it just did. Without such a reading, however, whatever is present becomes just another brute thing in the world. Considered merely as a material thing, the advertising sign makes no difference on the conduct of anyone, apart maybe from obstructing one's path. When I fail to notice the ad, my consumer habits go on as they would have. By contrast, when I fail to notice the bench, my motor habits get ruptured and I hurt my shins. This polar me hitting it and it hitting me clash can nevertheless grow into a relation that is more topologically complex, since an encounter with the advertising sign can alter my actions. I can stop, not just to avoid the obstacle, but to read what the ad has to say. Invariably, such a reading changes me in some minor or major way. When this happens, the relation becomes triadic, giving rise to semiosis, or the action of signs. Now, I doubt that my neighbor would be moved by any of this philosophical nitpicking. As far as he's concerned, he builds signs, full stop. Dealey thus observed that, quote, "It seems unlikely that the practice of referring to the sign vehicle simply as sign will ever fall fully to desuetude," end quote. We nevertheless have to ask, if the semiotic insight regarding triadicity is so true and important, why is the folk conception of the sign so bent on identifying the whole triad with only one of its parts? The answer, which will prove pivotal for my arguments, is that the sign vehicle is the part most directly available. This direct availability or foregrounding leads us to forget that the other parts are needed and operative. On my reading, this neglect of the whole is what lands Descartes in trouble. So, as a preparation for justifying that claim, let me now go over some essential points. I've been calling the sign's three parts: the sign vehicle, the object, and the interpretant. We may bicker about the labels, but there are principled reasons why we semioticians make this threefold distinction. The sign has a part that appears, a part that does not, and a third part that uses what appears to access what does not appear. This action of signs pervades our lives, so examples are not hard to find. For instance, I see a scar on your arm and use this visual experience to leapfrog to an accident that occurred long ago. I hear the sound milk, and I use this auditory experience to leapfrog to the idea of the protein-rich liquid. I run my fingers on a wooden pencil surface and use that tactile experience to leapfrog to my son's nasty tendency to chew on the pencil stick. I taste a soup and use this gustatory experience to leapfrog to the idea that my partner forgot to add salt. I smell acrid odors and use this olfactory experience to leapfrog to the idea that the soup may have been on the stovetop for too long. Now, I've deliberately offered multimodal examples involving sight, hearing, touch, taste, and smell to illustrate how the action of signs constitutes the warp and woof of our human Umwelt. Presumably, creatures with different senses also habituate to what their sense organs deliver, so as to extend, however tentatively, beyond what is here and now. In all instances, the triadic leapfrogging structure is the same, since it exploits what is present to reach something that is not present. Importantly, this leapfrogging does not have to stop at one hop. On the contrary, our waking mental life is best described as an almost incessant passage from one association to another. To continue with my tactile example, having touched the bumps on the pencil, I think of my son's chewing and then use this leapfrog to his anxiety, which in turn makes me think that I should probably ask him if something is bothering him, and so on and so forth. Naturally, what the handy shorthand leapfrog captures is an inference, which can range in strength from the conclusive to the probable to the purely conjectural. Given that such strings of deductive, inductive, and abductive inferences can be controlled and systematized, Charles Sanders Peirce identified logic with semiotics. It's common in logic to have arguments that have missing premises. Such arguments rely on certain assumptions but fail to state them. I want to suggest that the same thing happens in the semiosis of perception, where many of our background expectations do inferential work, yet hide from view. The basic structure of the triadic sign invites such hiding. The sign's object is, by definition, absent, or at any rate not fully revealed. Otherwise, it would not require a surrogate to make itself known. The interpretant that glues together this passage from the visible to the less visible is even harder to discern, since the entire value of habituation is to rely effectively on a habit without allocating any conscious awareness to it. So in terms of phenomenological salience, an absent object and evanescent interpretant simply cannot compete with a present sign vehicle. This uneven distribution of salience explains the continuing tendency, criticized by Deely, to confuse the element of representation in the foreground of signification with the sign itself. Now, even if 2/3 of the triadic sign essentially hides from view, it's a mistake to equate the sign with its vehicle. The other parts, the object and interpretant, are vital. The Coimbra scholars of late 16th century Portugal, for example, defined the sign as that which represents to the mind something different from itself, and were sensitive to the fact that one should explain its relation to the knower, the subject, and the thing signified, the object. In the Coimbra scholars' commentaries on Aristotle, we find the example of smoke, which, unless it reveals a hidden fire to some potency, would never bring knowledge of anything. This account of the sign as a triadic relation would later receive a fuller treatment and philosophical vindication in the work of John Poinsot, who studied under the Coimbra scholars and who, in 1632, defined the sign as that which represents something other than itself to a knowing power, end quote. An explicitly triadic model of the sign can thus be found in late medieval philosophy. Yet, as Deely recounts in Four Ages, the history of ideas took a very different turn. Indeed, the distinctive semiotic account that flourished in 16th and 17th century Portugal would lay dormant and neglected for centuries. The person most responsible for triggering this vast span of neglect, on Deely's telling, is the French philosopher and mathematician René Descartes. Descartes was exposed to the works of the Coimbra school. In a letter to his literary agent Marie Mersenne, dated September 30th, 1640, Descartes writes that, from his education, I can remember only some of the Coimbra senses. Despite being trained in the scholastic tradition of his time, Descartes had an aversion to history. That aversion to history, especially to medieval history, arguably survives to this day in most analytic philosophy departments. So, as I put it in a 2009 article, the day a rebellious young René Descartes walked out of the door of the Jesuit College of La Flèche for the last time, we all did. This leaving behind of all that had been done before was no accident. On the contrary, in his 1637 Discourse on Method, published a mere 5 years after Poinsot published his Tractatus de Signis, Descartes explains his reasons for explicitly disregarding his Jesuit education. Quote, "From my childhood I have been nourished upon letters, and because I was persuaded that by their means one could acquire a clear and certain knowledge of all that is useful in life, I was extremely eager to learn them. But as soon as I had completed the course of study at the end of which one is normally admitted to the ranks of the learned, I completely changed my opinion. For I found myself beset by so many doubts and errors that I came to think I had gained nothing from my attempts to become educated, but increased recognition of my own ignorance. And yet, I was at one of the most famous schools in Europe, where I thought there must be learned men if they existed anywhere on earth. There I had learned everything that the others were learning. Moreover, not content with the subjects they taught us, I had gone through all the books that fell into my hands." End quote. All this binge reading resulted, we might say, in intellectual indigestion. The commentary tradition alive in the schools of Coimbra and most of Europe championed a debate-based method requiring one to constantly find flaws and raise objections. In a way, Descartes would reprise this model in the objections and replies that followed his Meditations on First Philosophy. However, centuries of compendiously cataloging he said, she said, back and forth generated an impenetrable thicket, to borrow Deely's term. It was thus important for Descartes to start anew since, in his estimate, the opinions of past authorities did not add up to a tenable worldview. Descartes' intellectual indigestion thus triggered a radical response. In his words, "Considering how many diverse opinions learned men may maintain on a single question, even though it is impossible for more than one to be true, I held as well nigh false everything that was merely probable." Descartes' slide from the could be mistaken to is mistaken became the leitmotif of his entire philosophical project. The problem, however, is that most of the leapfrogs made in semiosis are less than conclusive. We have the rare privilege of deducing some of the time, but we make the bulk of our living by guessing and generalizing. Our inferential predicament is not like mathematics, but closer to hunting, where the stakes are high, yet risky and uncertain shots remain the norm. Abduction and induction can indeed be mistaken, but outside the philosopher's study room, such less than deductive inferences are indispensable. Of course, a philosopher accustomed to manipulating the simplified toy models of mathematics or geometry will suffer from a disciplinary bias and regard 100% certainty as a perfectly feasible standard. However, when one agrees with Descartes that the possibly mistaken should be regarded as definitely mistaken, one stops studying experience as it actually unfolds. I thus agree with Deely that when Western philosophy adopted Descartes' account of knowledge in mind, it took a wrong turn. In one of his most memorable phrases, Peirce invited us to stop pretending to doubt in philosophy what we do not doubt in our hearts. Whatever students and professors may say in a classroom, none of us live as skeptics. For the most part, we believe that things are as they seem. When my partner pours me a glass of orange juice in the morning, I drink it without hesitation, even though I know on a purely intellectual level that it is well within her powers to poison that juice. The same goes for our habitual expectations, which we can, do, and must trust. This default trust does not mean we should stick to our beliefs come what may. We should stand ready to revise beliefs that fail to match with the world. But unless we have been given a real cause to suspect that our habitual expectations fail us, we rely unthinkingly on those habits to guide our actions and decisions. A belief, in Alexander Bain's compact phrase, is that upon which a person is prepared to act. Applying that definition, one's belief that one's car is working is not revealed by a verbal declaration to that effect or private mental imagery, but rather by the fact that one switches on the ignition without hesitation, without checking under the hood beforehand. This account of a belief as a disposition to act, which has been developed by the pragmatist school, captures what it means to exist in time. To live is to predict what will happen next and thereby adopt a corresponding posture of readiness. This predictive element may be most apparent when, say, we invest money in the stock market or predict who will win a major election. But at every moment, we make a host of micro predictions that we don't notice. As I walk, for instance, my right foot expects to land on something firm. That expectation proves correct, which leads my left foot to anticipate and confirm a similar outcome, and so on, until something in my path ruptures that habitual chain. A simple motor activity like walking thus strings together minor beliefs, each of which is a bet about what will happen next. We can add an extra layer of commitment to our predictions by making them explicit in a linguistic community. But the pervasive phenomenon of anticipation shows that predictions can be, and usually are, subdiscursive. Now, some habitual anticipations are inconsequential. If, for instance, the surface that I step on is not as firm as I initially predicted, my walking style can simply make adjustments. I might perhaps twist my ankle if I fail to adjust my actions properly, but the cost of being wrong is relatively low. Other anticipations, by contrast, are more consequential. My trust in my partner's fidelity, for example, underpins countless other actions. That trust might be ruptured by the discovery of some damaging text message, so abandoning my mistaken belief in her trustworthiness would demand a vast reworking of my web of beliefs. I might not start testing my daily orange juice for poison, but it certainly would not be business as usual in our relationship. Importantly, in this action-oriented account, revisions of one's habitual beliefs are undertaken only when one is given a real cause to do so. Unless I detect that the surface of the sidewalk is uneven or slippery, I don't walk ultra cautiously. Similarly, unless I discover evidence that my partner is having an affair, I continue to trust her. The world may not always be as I expected, but I let the mismatches reveal themselves if and when they occur. This acknowledgement of fallibility does not alter my daily dealings in any way. I continue to act as if things will work out because, for the most part, they do. Now, I really like the account just given. Descartes, however, will have none of it. The only conclusions that pass muster under his stringent epistemological regime are conclusions that resist all conceivable doubt. Such doubt-resistant axioms might be few in number, so care must be taken to employ only deduction when inferring further propositions from them. In all instances, however, this certainty-only epistemology sets the bar quite high, since detecting even the slightest possibility of error in an idea or experience demands that we totally abandon that idea or experience. Now, as we saw earlier, animals like us get to know the world by leapfrogging from what is present to what is less so. Naturally, we can err in those attributions. On some rare occasions, for example, the smoke discussed by the Coimbra school might be caused not by fire, but by a Hollywood special effects company. As Umberto Eco wrote in A Theory of Semiotics, every time there is possibility of lying, there is a sign function. How should we respond to this possibility of error or deception? Just as a person fearing infidelity might opt for perpetual celibacy, a person fearing mistaken belief can opt for skepticism. Given that our beliefs are acquired by habituating to whatever inputs our five senses provide, one of the first things to go in Descartes' inquiry is the evidence of those senses. With this single decision, the whole world vanishes. Indeed, near the end of his first meditation, Descartes supposes that an evil genius, supremely powerful and clever, has directed his entire effort at deceiving me. I will regard the heavens, the air, the earth, colors, shapes, sounds, and all external things as nothing but the bedeviling hoaxes of my dreams, with which he lays snares for my credulity. I will regard myself as not having hands, or eyes, or flesh, or blood, or any senses, but as nevertheless falsely believing that I possess all these things. I will remain resolute and steadfast in this meditation, and even if it is not within my power to know anything true, it is certainly within my power to take care resolutely to withhold my assent to what is false, lest this deceiver, however powerful, however clever he may be, may have any effect on me. With this passage, the modern age of understanding begins, and the wrong turn is taken. After Descartes, it became common for philosophers to doubt everything related to the senses. This at a time when modern science was routinely making groundbreaking empirical discoveries. Yet, as Dealey forcefully argued, philosophy and science did not have to part ways. The medieval philosophical tradition, for example, was able to successfully deploy the devil's advocate as an instrument for the advancement of knowledge without having that instrument destroy all knowledge. First, summarize the situation as follows. Descartes is the father of modern philosophy. In the spirit of Cartesianism, that which principally distinguishes it from the scholasticism which it displaced is that philosophy must begin with universal doubt, whereas scholasticism had never questioned fundamentals. Furthermore, the call to doubt everything is motivated by a fallacy. Indeed, one of Descartes' ablest critics, Pierre Gassendi, wondered why Descartes, quote, did not make a simple and brief statement to the effect that you were regarding your previous knowledge as uncertain. Why instead did you consider everything as false, which seems more like adopting a new prejudice than relinquishing an old one, end quote. Could not have said it better. To better grasp the fallacy identified by Gassendi, imagine that I show you a cardboard box and tell you that there is a rabbit in it. The cardboard box being opaque and closed, you cannot check its contents, so you cannot verify my claim. Now, you might leapfrog from the visible box to any non-visible content you wish, but this would be pure conjecture, the weakest inference on the abduction, induction, deduction spectrum. In this scenario, the most reasonable conclusion is not there is no rabbit inside, but rather there may be a rabbit inside. After all, for all you know, things might turn out exactly as I said they would. Naturally, you would have to explore the box's content to confirm this. Still, to conclude that there is no rabbit inside the box is to draw a conclusion stronger than what the premises permit. What the situation calls for is a non-committal stance, not a commitment to falsehood. Thankfully, we're usually able to explore the contents of a cardboard box. When the Amazon delivery person brings me a package, I don't sit there pondering what she delivered. Rather, I open the box. True, there are some things that we humans will never know. But more often than not, this is simply because there are things that we will never be in a position to know. Whether or not there are an even or odd number of stars in the universe, for example, is a perfectly soluble question. even though limits on our exploratory capacities may forever leave us unable to render a verdict either way. Such limits are a contingent part of the human condition, but they in no way eclipse the instances where we are able to verify what is the case. We are finite, but reality in principle does not elude us. It's therefore overblown to put reality out of reach merely on account of our finite position and ability to make errors. Descartes, however, doubts whatever can be doubted. In a remark that anticipates the pragmatist distinction between genuine and paper doubt, Gassendi tells Descartes that no one will believe that you have really convinced yourself that not one thing you formerly knew is true, or that your senses or God or an evil demon have managed to deceive you all the time, end quote. The simplest explanation, then, is not that the world has vanished, but that one is being disingenuous. We can politely listen to Descartes explain his reasons for disbelieving the evidence of his senses, but to the extent that a belief is that upon which a person is prepared to act, we're entitled to reply, that is all well and good, but you don't really believe any of it. As David Hume wrote, skeptical ideas flourish and triumph in the schools, but as soon as they leave the shade and by the presence of the real objects are put in opposition to the more powerful principles of our nature, they vanish like smoke and leave the most determined skeptic in the same condition as other mortals, end quote. To use a recent expression, skepticism is a luxury belief that only the leisure class can afford. Interestingly, Descartes first had the idea of escaping the world and retreating to first-person experience in November 1619, when he spent the night in the silence, solitude, and warmth of a large stove. But it's rather hard to maintain conviction in the illusion of things when one is instead, say, digging a deep trench with a shovel. Now, to be sure, Descartes regards his skepticism as purely transitional, since he thinks he can eventually quell skeptical doubts once and for all with carefully chosen axioms, such as God's benevolence and the obviousness of his own thinking. So, in fairness to Descartes, his intent was never destructive. On the contrary, he decided early on to, quote, devote my whole life to cultivating my reason and advancing as far as I could in the knowledge of the truth, end quote. Descartes wiped the slate clean, not of any nihilistic impulse, but in order to build something better. So if we're to gauge the man by his intents, he's beyond reproach. That said, in the crucible of actual history, where the consequences of such philosophical projects becomes manifest, Descartes' rationalist account of knowledge has proven to be an utter failure. In hindsight, what he bequeathed to future generations is not some triumphant solution, but rather plaguing worries about the reliability of sensory experience. Indeed, there's a consensus among scholars that, according to Descartes, the senses misrepresent the material world and its properties in normal circumstances. The pencil sitting on your desk may, for all we know, be an avocado, say. Now, since reality eludes us, even in the best of cases, Descartes will invoke God's benevolent character in order to migrate his thinking ego from its solitary confines to the external world. Here's how Dealey recounts Descartes' strategy. God, being supremely perfect, cannot be a deceiver on pain of contradiction. This is the metaphysical foundation on which the certainty of human knowledge rests whenever it achieves a clear and distinct conception, because every clear and distinct perception is undoubtedly something, and hence cannot come from nothing, but must necessarily have God for its author. Descartes says it 40 or 50 different ways, but the unshakable foundation for truth for him comes always back to the same point, not to the cogito ergo sum, as vulgarly taught even among Cartesians, but to the realization that God is and can be no deceiver. This response is overblown. To my mind, it's tantamount to resetting the universe at the moment of the Big Bang, simply because one's ketchup bottle got clogged. Just give it a couple more smacks in the back, one is tempted to say, and everything will fall into place. In any event, a grandiose appeal to God's benevolence is not needed, since there was no deception to begin with. This is because what one sees when one looks at an example that's misleading often includes the things that mislead it. Take the stick in water. When we see a stick in water that looks bent, we're not just seeing a stick, we're seeing the stick in the water. In fact, given the presence of water, light, and the optical laws of refraction, seeing a straight stick would have counted as a deception. The senses can thus indicate features that one has not yet scientifically understood. The senses, then, are not just reliable, they are more reliable than we think, since they are the wellspring of whatever error correction we can manage. Once we adjust our expectations to reflect whatever new knowledge we have acquired, the misplaced sense of mystery vanishes. Hence, far from putting reality out of reach, semiotic theory, in the Poinceau per Sibioc tradition, ought to reinvigorate our confidence in the possibility of objective knowledge. Semiotic theory makes room for error and lying, as Eco famously noted. But, less famously, it also makes room for self-corrective interpretive processes capable of overcoming those transient mistakes. There is no reason, then, to subscribe to whole-scale skepticism. The philosopher's external world is closer than you think. Nevertheless, as the reflexes of my novice students show, Descartes' distrust of the senses had a lasting influence. If the history of Western philosophy took a wrong turn when it embraced Descartes' account of knowledge and perception, what went wrong? One thing that we can do is backtrack to imagine what was going on before that mistake was made. As Dealey writes, whatever else is to be said of the philosophy of Descartes and the colleagues it inspires over the modern centuries, you can see that it proceeds blithely unaware of the carefully developed Hispanic account of the sign. Like Dealey, I think we should recover the semiotic insights that were left behind when Descartes decided to start anew. Specifically, I think that misconceptions about what constitutes a sign are partly what leads Descartes to meet the possibility of error with an overblown skeptical response. I thus want to gradually reintroduce the semiotic ideas about triadicity mentioned earlier to nip Cartesian skepticism in the bud. In their discussion of perception and deception, Descartes and his peers addressed the example of a stick that is partially immersed in water. I'm more concerned with a problem situation than a body of text, so let me anchor my discussion to this concrete example, which nicely illustrates the issues that concern me. Suppose that you partially fill a glass with water and plunge a pencil in the water such that the bottom half of the pencil is submerged while the top half is above water. When one looks down at the glass, the wooden pencil stick will appear bent, with a more or less pronounced bend appearing at the surface where water and air meet. Now, the pencil is straight and cannot be bent without breaking, so, ostensibly, something is amiss. A first indication that this puzzlement might be remedied comes from the fact that the specific angle of the bend will change as one adopts different vantages. As an embodied act involving two eye sockets that are spaced apart, vision includes depth perception. Moreover, if you know anything about James J. Gibson's ecological account of perception, you will know that vision also involves affordances that prime motor responses. Touch, on this account, contributes to sight. Now, someone might object that a Gibsonian misunderstands the nature of philosophical problems. However, one could also say that a Cartesian misunderstands the psychological nature of perception. At the risk of being lumped with the approach now called naturalism, I would champion the second gloss, which says that Descartes proceeds from a mistaken view of the senses and perception. If we are to describe lived experience as it actually unfolds, we must grant that human vision is not a still photo. We can move, we can touch, we can explore. So to know more, one must do more. On this score, phenomenology corroborates our best vision science. Despite this, let us suppose for the sake of argument that one's perspective on the glass and pencil stay absolutely fixed, such that one is given a static visual experience. What, one might ask, is wrong with the picture currently shown? In a way, absolutely nothing. Using the terminology introduced at the start, we can say that what makes this image show up on the skeptic's radar is the interpretant that she brings to it. Specifically, skeptics and realists alike come to this picture with a prior habit and thus expect the pencil to be straight. It turns out that when the pencil is plunged in water, it doesn't look straight. The expectations that we bring to the situation are thus frustrated. Yet, absent this prior expectation of straightness, there's nothing inherently problematic or troublesome about looking at crooked lines. Why would there be? Apart from the habits that we bring to the experience, Why should line 2 be regarded as intrinsically more suspect than line 1? We know beforehand that pencils are straight, so naturally we apply this collateral information to the image before us. This comparison creates a mismatch between what we're used to seeing and what we now see. The very notion of a mismatch, however, makes no sense apart from a comparison. Remove the comparison with prior expectations, and you thereby remove the very possibility of a match or mismatch. It's a little bit like stepping on a scale and seeing that one weighs 80 kilos. If you do not bring any prior expectation about what your weight is, you cannot be surprised of a weight gain or a weight loss, nor can you have any reason to think that the instrument is malfunctioning. Anyone wishing to make a fuss about a bent pencil or 80-kilo display must therefore import that fuss from elsewhere. To put the same point another way, were this the first pencil one saw, one would conclude that pencils are crooked. Hence, without conflicting habits, nothing is misleading about the picture experience. So, slowing down the situation and identifying the components of semiosis, the image experienced is a sign vehicle, which is crooked but stands for something straight as the object in virtue of a habitual interpretant. Such a semiotic analysis helps, but what makes the situation tricky is that the habitual interpretant, which ties together the triadic sign, usually effaces itself. As we saw earlier, habits are of no use when we're conscious of them. So, looking at the pencil in water, we expect the pencil to be straight, but we easily forget to inventory this expectation in our philosophical account. This neglect is understandable. Normally, we don't spend time consciously mentioning the various anticipations that we bring to each experience. Still, those habits are operative in everything we do, so anyone who is puzzled by the partially immersed pencil must know a thing or two about pencils. We know full well that wooden pencil sticks are straight and don't bend, so it's too late to turn back the clock and feign ignorance. Nevertheless, if we employ a supposition of absence called precisive abstraction and artificially delete this habitual interpretant, the reference to a straight stick vanishes as well, leaving us only with a sign vehicle, which is just some dumb image. Under those exclusionary conditions, study that image all you want and nothing will be found to be amiss. Indeed, as Gassendi said, even in cases where doubt is permissible, at least we may not doubt that things appear to us in such and such a way. It cannot but be wholly true that they appear as they do. Interestingly, Descartes agreed. However, he does not think that the manifest character of appearances accomplishes much, since, in his words, the point at issue concerns the truth about the things located outside us. Perceptual deliverances that cannot help but appear as they appear are, on this Cartesian picture, merely inside us. So for Descartes, we still need something to pierce past the veil of appearances and reach the way things really are. He'll engage in a massive detour to get there, visiting God himself on his long journey to get to what is right before him. It's an impressive story, to be sure. Yet, as was mentioned, keeping our vantage fixed is merely a provisional constraint, introduced for the sake of argument. So to find out whether the stick is bent or straight, there is something we can do, namely pull it out and feel it with our hands. Why should epistemology ban such recourse to exploration? Double-checking may be more involved than checking, but it is more parsimonious than invoking the Almighty. Gassendi reminded Descartes that, quote, we sometimes have an understanding of the truth as when the stick is taken out of the water, and in such a case there cannot be any doubt at all about the truth, end quote. Gassendi's fix is simple, and I would argue correct. He notes that, quote, owing to refraction, a stick which is in fact straight appears bent in water. What corrects the error? The intellect? Not at all, that is the sense of touch. And the same sort of thing must be taken to occur in other cases. Hence, if you have recourse to all your senses when they're in good working order, and they all give the same report, you will achieve the greatest certainty of which a man is naturally capable. End quote. Amen. Now, when we believe that the stick is in fact straight, then, as Descartes rightly says, we perform an act of judgment. Judgment is a technical term of art for an inference that we perform. So in perceptual experience, things appear thus and so, but such appearances mean little until and unless a thinking agent judges that things are indeed thus and so. This is usually regarded as an intellectual act. It might be argued that our sense organs often perform that extra step instinctually. Either way, judgments of veridicality are essentially a bet. When I judge the stick to be bent, I bet that it will stay bent once removed from the water. Conversely, when I judge the stick to be straight, I expect subsequent experiences to yield a verdict of straight. Now, crucially, to count as rational, a judgment should be an all things considered judgment. Hence, in the case of the partially submerged stick, past inputs from our other senses need to be considered. What we know beforehand thus colors what we're prepared to bet on. Similarly, future inputs from our other senses must figure in the deliberation, since it is only once the pencil is removed that we can discover if our bet was wise or misguided. Factor that traditional evidence properly, and you will judge correctly. No God required. Hence, on my semiotic diagnosis, everything hinges on the habitual expectations that we bring to our experiences. The stick in water can be deemed illusory only if we bring to it a history of associating pencils with straight forms. Experiences, visual or otherwise, are deceptive only insofar as they frustrate those prior expectations. Such expectations must never depart from our theoretical account, for it is only when an interpretant takes an image as a sign of something that the question of its truth or falsehood can even be raised. We said earlier that to have a mismatch, you need two things. In this case, a present visual experience and a memory of the past, plus a third thing that takes stock of their difference. Think, for example, of a grammatical mistake. Suppose one encounters the following. In one big gulp, he drank the cocktail. There's nothing inherently problematic about the letters that I've just strung together. So the only thing that makes one suspect that something is amiss is one's expectation to find a one-word arrangement, cocktail, at the end of the sentence. A mistake is present, but remove what came before, and everything is fine. What we said earlier when we juxtaposed the two black lines can thus be said here too. Apart from the habits that we bring to the experience, why should letters 2 be regarded as intrinsically more suspect than letters 1? Surely it would be overblown to conclude that the alphabet is unreliable because its arrangements can sometimes deviate from how we expect them to be. I submit that the same may be said about sensory inputs, which are innocent in themselves but can sometimes be conjoined in unexpected ways. Now, to rectify a widespread error, one must not only rectify that error, but also explain why it's widespread. Let me therefore conclude by sharing a conjecture about why the overblown response of Cartesian doubt continues to be deemed so plausible by so many. Regular people, as we saw at the outset, routinely conflate signed vehicles and signs. The part is taken for the whole. The signed vehicle is necessary, but folk semiotics elevates it to sufficient. This confused way of thinking may not bother my neighbor. Still, it remains a mistake. Likewise, Descartes takes a standalone visual experience, a static photographic shot, if you will, and talks about it as if it was somehow representational. Yet, how could a standalone visual experience be representational if we do not factor in what it is a representation of and the habitual expectation that makes it that way? To say that X represents falsely, one must say that X represents. This cannot be done, I have argued, without appealing to whatever non-X that X is supposed to stand for, and the habitual interpretation that brings that standing for expectation to bear on X. The full account, then, is essentially the one developed by late medieval philosophers like the Coimbra scholars and Poinsot. X stands for Y to Z. Breaking with this triadic account, Descartes pulls the X away from Y and Z, yet he continues to hold up X to representational standards. In other words, he tries to have it both ways. This explains why specialists cannot agree on whether Descartes regarded the senses as representing or not. Is the pencil in fact straight or bent? The proper reply, I've argued, is not who can tell, but rather let's find out. This is because experience, unfolding in time and drawing on multimodal sources, constantly supplies one with further signs, enough in fact to eventually come to a verdict. It is straight. Our knowledge at any given moment may be incomplete. Yet we're not spectators, but rather actors. We can, moreover, collaborate and pool our findings. So, with time and collaborative inquiry, things eventually fall into place. Descartes finds the stick in water deceptive only because he's artificially extracted that experience from the very semiotic sequence that gives it meaning. This isolation is something that a process-based approach would allow only with great caution, because sign vehicles, by themselves, are not signs. As we saw when we started our inquiry, the same confusion plagues common sense. Are the vacant advertising signs for sale on park benches and recycling bins really signs? Well, yes and no. Once we keep in mind the additional components needed to say yes, the possibility that an advertisement or submerged pencil might lead an interpretant to the wrong object becomes deflated, a trivial consequence of the fact that habitual expectations we bring to situations do not always pan out as planned. Admittedly, it doesn't come naturally for us to be mindful of the evanescent habit that lets us reach an intended object. How many habitual expectations does one bring to this experience right now? 10 habits? 100? 1,000,000? The evanescence of the interpretant stems precisely from the fact that one will notice only the tacit expectations that are frustrated, like when we encounter cocktail, where we expected to find the one word cocktail. So, if we remind ourselves that, owing to our micro predictions and anticipations, there's always more to experience than meets the eye, we can begin to realize that some of the philosophical problems that Descartes sets out to solve are not actually problematic, and thus do not require any drastic overhaul in our theory of knowledge. Thus, in an elegant loop, it turns out that platitudes about never truly knowing the external world are related to the widespread practice, aptly criticized by John Dewey, of referring to the sign vehicle simply as sign. I submit that if one corrects this folk semiotic misconception, one will see why Cartesian worries about perception are overblown. Dewey opined that we semioticians are powerless to alter how the word sign is commonly used. But who knows? Maybe in time, we can alter the socks that hipsters wear.